All right. I think we're all on, yeah? Am I missing anybody? Maybe missing one person. Okay, we're going to go ahead and go. You guys all know me. I'm going to let our panelists slash speakers introduce themselves and tell you guys a little bit about what they do professionally. I hope you all had time to look at their websites and their social media and that kind of thing, so you get a good sense of how labor intensive the stuff that they do for the public is. So if y'all don't mind, Liz and Nini, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, so I am Dr. Elisabeth Marnik. As I said, you can call me Liz. I am a PhD trained scientist. My background is in immunology and genetics. So I used genetic tools to study different aspects of the immune system. I then have done and have worn a lot of hats. I was a faculty member for a while where I taught immunology and microbiology and a lot of other things. But then the COVID-19 pandemic happened, which is, I think, how a lot of us ended up in this space. And I felt a responsibility to try to connect what I knew from my background with what I was seeing spreading online. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is I was actually also raised in an anti-science, anti-vaccine household. So I was seeing people like my mom and my dad and my brother and my aunts and uncles being the ones who were falling for this false information during COVID and even now to some extent, and then spreading it. So I was really felt like that personal responsibility to try to address it. So from there, I started a public Instagram account, Science with Liz. That's how I've met Needy and some other amazing people who I can now also call my friends. And Kimmery and I met online too. So that's been great. I also write the Substack called From the Science Classroom for people who like more long form content. And then I wear a lot of different hats. My day job is actually switching. I am becoming the executive director of the Evidence Collective, which is a new organization founded by Caitlin Jedalina and Jessica Steyer. And I can link at that webpage if you want more, but we're really focused on creating kind of a surround sound approach so that we can break echo chambers and get people the information that they need in social media, but also more so in communities and in other places that they are. And then I am the chief scientific officer for a nonprofit called Those Nerdy Girls, where you can Google us. We have a Substack, Instagram, Facebook pages, where again, we're translating science and public health topics to the public in all sorts of formats and ways. I'm also a mom of two and a runner and a hiker, and I live in Maine.
All right. Yeah, Liz and I actually have become very close friends. I'm in California. She even flew out to like my daughter's birthday party, her first birthday party. So hi, I'm in California. So good morning. Just kind of waking up. My name is Nini Munoz. I'm originally from Colombia. I came to the U.S. when I was about 17, I want to say. And I pursued a degree in electrical engineering. So it's slightly different. My background was or is still in device physics and data science. Like Liz, I found myself during the pandemic under lockdown seeing a lot of misinformation, especially misinformation surrounding our vaccine efficacy data. Right. And so with my background in data science and statistics, I did teach math for many years while I was a teaching assistant at Cornell. I decided to start combating some of that by doing statistics tutorials and then kind of also pointing out the logic pitfalls and a lot of the argumentation that we see with misinformation, because you take a look at it in detail, you really see that it's like a logic, it's a logical inconsistency. I started doing that in 2020, and then it kind of took a life of its own. My social media took a life of its own, and so I do what I can. I work with teachers here locally a lot, and some of my efforts recently have shifted to the long game, which is preparing teachers and high school teachers with content to teach statistical and data literacy early on. Because I do think that the issue that we're seeing today, this didn't happen overnight. I think that information became ubiquitous. And I always say this, people conflate access with understanding. So people think that because they can access something, they can understand it. My reply to that is always like, well, read the manual and fly the plane, right? We know that that's not true. And so what I'm seeing now is a bigger need to really introduce more statistical and data literacy early on. Early on, we're talking elementary, high school. And so I'm forming a community here in Santa Barbara with many moms who are scientists and engineers and medical professionals to start that effort, that community effort. But yeah. And so a pleasure to meet you all. I'm very happy to be here, and hopefully I can help answer questions.
Great. Thank you guys so much. I think I learned stuff I did not know about both of you. The students have some questions, and I do too. I'll save mine for the end if there's time. But did one of you guys want to go ahead and hit them with a hard-hitting question about data science or communication in the medical realm?
I kind of had a more general question, if that's okay, just about having like social media presences more generally, and how that like correlates with your work and how people perceive you. I think even just like reflecting on my own life, trying to like avoid social media in certain phases of my life so I don't kind of get drawn in or like rage baited. I feel like a lot of people use that term. So how do you like have, I guess, balance in your life between engaging in social media and creating all these posts, and also like keeping your mental health about you and engaging with social media in a beneficial way?
Yeah,
We
and staying
don't.
safe.
I'm being totally honest. Like there are days where Liz and I are texting and it's really overwhelming. I think with time, I've learned, and Liz, you can speak to your experience, to create those boundaries. Like, you know what? I really cannot do this right now. I tend to try to post early in the morning or after work. And honestly, I just kind of like put it away for some time, because it's really easy to be dragged into rabbit holes with people that are not there to change their mind. And I think one thing that I like looking back 6 years ago when I started doing this, it was very hard to discern who was there asking a genuine question versus people that were just trying to like sea lion you, right? And really just trying to rage bait you or introduce doubt. Because a lot of people are there just to like, discredit you. And they have tactics, which is one of the reasons why even this morning I posted about the tools of propaganda. Because I think it's really important for people to recognize those. Like once you see those, you really can't unsee them, right? And so I think with time, I've learned, okay, this person is genuinely interested, this person is not, and just not trying to respond to every message because that's overwhelming. I don't really respond to many messages anymore. Uh, and then just remind yourself that you do what you can do. You don't have to talk about everything. There's just too much going on, and allow for other creators in those spaces. Okay, like, like for instance, Liz is better versed in immunology, right, than I am. I don't Early on, I remember trying to do like my first immunology post and I was like, oh, I can't do this. And then we started collaborating. And now I do more of the data science, right? Statistical literacy, design, like trial design, that kind of stuff. So learning where your expertise ends and somebody else's begins, but also create that boundary to say, hey, I'm not going to engage, right? And it's hard, but over time you get better and better at it.
Yeah, and I think one thing to keep in mind is that you don't, like Mimi said, you don't have to respond to everything. Though I will say that once you have a platform with a decent size following, I do feel like there is a pressure to respond to certain things, because otherwise silence can sometimes be equated with, right, complicity. So I think that pressure of like how to say things in ways that, are as accurate and as, balanced. And I mean, sometimes there's no balance, right, with certain things. But it can be very hard to kind of balance those types of things, because we are people at the end of the day who also have, a lot of other, like, neither of us make our money off of social media.
Nope.
There are some people out there who make money off of social media. I have not found out how to do that. Like,
Yeah.
I maybe get $30 a month from Facebook.
Yeah,
And
we've
that's
been
it.
told how to do it, but the way to do it is a lot of people sell things, and we can't, the minute that we do that, we lose credibility. So people that are making money on social media, like some people are fair, some people are really great communicators and have YouTube channels, and that's a good way of monetizing.
Yeah.
But most people that are making money on social media are journalists with a lot of followings, right? Like, like Heather Cox Richardson is a historian and she's got a massive platform, or people that are just trying to sell you something, right? That's really how you monetize. And we can't put, we've talked about it a lot. We can't put our brand behind that because a lot of these things that people want to sell online don't have reliable data. So if we do that, then we're no different than the individuals that we are, kind of, railing against, that are doing this to confuse and to disseminate misinformation.
So basically, y'all are spending an enormous amount of time and effort and resources to do something for the public good for which you are not really being compensated.
Yeah.
Makes me wish that there was some sort of national award for such endeavors, because
There
it
is.
is. Oh, we know how to
But
nominate you guys.
they tend to choose people who do more long form than they
Yeah.
do people who do short form social media.
One thing I would add, Alex, to what they said is, and this is for me a little bit easier to do on Facebook than it is on Instagram, so I miss a lot of the younger people. But if you do engage with somebody who's coming at the issue from a different and possibly erroneous viewpoint, I find it really helps my mental health to try to think of them as sympathetically as I can, to see them as a person who's confused, or to see them as somebody who has a need, and to try to engage with them, respectfully, and eventually, like, not often, but sometimes it works, to persuade people.
Yeah, in general, I always try to avoid rage or shaming or blaming in my posts, but also in my replies to people, which sometimes means I like go scream into like a Signal group with a bunch of our friends, or I like go walk with my husband because I'm annoyed. But I try to be very kind and compassionate in my replies, or I just, don't engage with certain people who I think might be trolling or those types of things.
Yeah, I think that in general, one thing that I do when I talk, because I do engage with individuals a lot, and I just point, I am a little bit more of a straight shooter, and I will point to the logical inconsistency. Like that's one of the, I actually don't lead with data, and I'm coming as a person who used to lead with data. A lot of my posts early on were very data driven, and when I switched my style to kind of leading with pointing out the inconsistency and the argument, the double standard. If you really think about a lot of the misinformation, it's got no pillars to stand on, right? Because it's a double standard, right? So here are individuals that will say, hey, don't trust the pharmaceutical industry because X and Y and Z, but somehow you can trust me. And I'm selling you something in my link in bio, right? And people don't question those double standards, right? Or for instance, that one thing that it's pretty common, and so much of what I'm seeing right now is that there is the rejection of science that we're seeing is collateral damage to the rejection of expertise. So it's, I recently spoke to Christian Anderson, who was tasked with determining whether COVID was man-made. He was literally the scientist who the administration came to and said, hey, this is your hypothesis. Can you determine whether SARS-CoV-2 was man-made? He couldn't conclude that, right? And I spoke to him and he said to me, this is really interesting because we knew that he knew what was going to happen like a year ago, right? like November 2024, he said they're going to come for the scientists. And he thinks that so much of it was that science couldn't deliver that neat little villain during the pandemic. So a lot of what we're seeing is just kind of like rejection of expertise. And one thing that's really important to question when people bring these narratives is, why are you giving that more weight? Like, why are you believing some person who has never published, who hasn't, conducted any real studies? And if you claim they're as knowledgeable as they are, why don't they bring it to the peer review process, right? Because again, it's a double standard that somehow the whole scientific community is not to be trusted, right? If you think that's pretty shaky, right? It assumes that either scientists are inept or corrupt, right? Like the large community. And so it's really, I like to lead with that because, I just experience moments of silence when I bring these arguments, like, wait, and I make them really think about that logic argumentation, because it's pretty shaky. Once you start, the more you do this, like, it's practice, 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 like anything else. What I can point to now, 6 years after doing this, I wasn't able to do it like 6 years ago. And now it's almost like innate. People say something, I'm like, oh, wait. And you point to like the inconsistency, the double standard. And I lead a lot with that. And I have found that it's really helpful. Like, I have friends who are like, hey, Nini, you know what? I am really glad that you pushed me in that direction. I had a friend the other day who was on the Yuka app, the Yuka app that shows people like ingredients. And she was really like obsessing about specific ingredients. And I just sat there next to her and I'm like, honey, you're having a glass of wine right now. Like, how, you're having like an actual like carcinogen right now. Right. And so then you start really, pointing to those things. And she later on went on to tell our other friends, she was like, I'm really glad Nini pushed me to think about that, because I hadn't thought about that. Right. And people just don't, we create these echo chambers and these biases, and there's just these blind spots. People have a lot of blind spots for misinformation. And I found my reach, I can't even say that it tripled, I think 10 times. And my following doubled in about 6 to 7 months when I started doing that. When I switched from enter with the data to like pointing to the inconsistency of the argument, that's a shift that I made unconsciously too. I just kind of started doing that. And then it really was very effective with reach. Very, very effective.
Who else has a question?
I kind of have a question that, kind of somewhat goes along with that, but, obviously I think when we talk about misinformation and, the kind of, not trusting scientists, I do feel like there is, our political sphere has definitely contributed to that. And so I was just kind of curious if, especially in the past, year with this new administration, if you've seen like a shift or you see it getting worse, just kind of like how has it evolved since you started it, in regards to politics and, that kind of thing.
Liz, you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has gotten worse just because, right, like false information is now being spread by the people who are leading our country, RFK, all of the other people, right? They're now spreading that false information. And I think it's a combination of factors. They're doing that because they have power, they want to make money, it's very profitable for them, and those are motivations there. But then they're also really good at preying on people's fears and their distrust and their need for empowerment. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there are a lot of groups of people who have very real and understandable reasons to not trust, science and medical institutions. But what often happens is that people spreading false information are really good at making it seem like, hey, this thing is going to be your fix for everything. And if you do this, you're going to feel better, or you're going to be able to avoid cancer, or you're going to be able to do this. So Nini and I have talked about this a lot, is that, right, the false information, those spreading that are really good at giving people a sense of empowerment and
Yep.
feeling like they have ownership over their decisions. When in reality, sometimes we have to tell a patient, hey, I don't have an answer for you. And that's not right. That's hard for the patient to hear. But what I like to remind people, particularly if you're going to be working with patients, is that how you manage those patient interactions can make a huge difference in terms of how you might push people in one direction over the other. So sometimes people can be dismissed or told, it's all in their head, or 100 other really not great responses. But even just acknowledging the person, being like, I know this is really hard and I'm sorry I don't have an answer for you yet, can go a long way into not pushing them towards, that pathway of wellness and all of that misinformation. So I think we have to acknowledge that there are errors in our system that have really helped set up this moment. But then the actors now running our federal government are exploiting that and making it a lot worse than it would have been otherwise.
Correct. So I want to bring up 2 points. The first thing is that, and I always bring this up, and it always works. Like I've talked to like people like literally people who voted for this, and they're like, "Whoa, I never thought of that." Every time I bring it up, and that is that people are conflating policy and science, right? We have a broken healthcare system, right? And I think, well, I think we know that that is a major grievance of most of us. Most Americans are unhappy with their healthcare system. So one of the things that this administration has done is weaponize that. So they're looking at the failures of policy and blaming science, scapegoating science, right? And I'm the type of person who, like, I will go out with these people for lunch. Like, I'll befriend them. And that's how I build a lot of my stuff online, comes from talking to them, from like really just sitting with them and really trying to dissect like the argument. Like the other day I had lunch with somebody who I know voted for this because, when after like the election, they had a big sign on their desk that said Trump won. And I'm like, I'm going to talk to that guy. And so I went and I talked to him. And he was complaining about our healthcare institutions. He was saying, well, like the CDC is crap, public health sucks. And then I wanted to dig deeper and understand what was happening. Turns out that this person was suffering from like a debilitating, like, maybe like a bladder infection or something, couldn't get any healthcare. And they were just frustrated. And so what you're seeing a lot, and going back to what Liz was saying, right? So it's just not the weaponizing our broken policy to scapegoat science, right? And remember, science operates within systems that either stifle it or allow it to thrive, right? So even like, we can take a look at systemic biases. I'm not saying science is not immune to bias, but again, it's operating within these systems. And so you see, of course, the, weaponizing a lot of what is broken policy, like, our pharmaceutical industry, like, we clearly have an issue of profits over people. And look, I understand that, we don't want to take a look at this in isolation. I'm never like a either or. When you take a look at one of the reasons America leads is in innovation is because of its capitalistic infrastructure. Is it all good? Is it all bad? That's a separate discussion. But we do have a problem with unaffordable healthcare. So that's really been weaponized to dismantle the credibility of science in people's eyes. And of course, and along with that, immigrants. You're seeing like the narrative of like, oh, like the immigrants, you're not getting healthcare. And I'm like, well, the immigrants are all locked up now and our healthcare premiums are still going up. So again, it's weaponizing. The second thing I want to bring up, and back to Liz's point, because we talk a lot about this, and this is what I think for physicians. So I usually give this talk, I give talks to physicians about like risk communication. And if you dissect the messaging of misinformation and wellness, at its very core, what it's selling is agency in a world of chaos. right? Like you listen to Huberman, you listen to Joe Rogan, you listen to any wellness podcaster, they're giving you a list of things to do. Obviously, we understand that those things don't really work or there's limited evidence for it. But when we are scared, especially when you have, a chronic condition or something for which science doesn't have all the answers for, right? People seek comfort, right? People seek certainty. People, like at that point, people seek something that they can do, right? Like to help them, improve their symptoms and have a sense of control. And so that's where I think it's an interesting avenue for physicians to try to co-opt some of the same language of empowerment and giving patients agency, right? So for instance, like, there are things that you as, physicians will know, okay, like, well, this clearly there's no evidence for this, but you can say, oh, but there are other things that you could be doing to, like, again, the pillars of good health, right? Sleep, lower stress, good nutrition. And that in itself will be empowering for individuals. Because I think this is what these podcasters are selling, and many different flavors too. The backlash against the feminist movement is also wrapped in that language of empowerment. Like, oh, but it's wrapped in the language of like, oh, if you're going to be better off if other groups don't make progress, right? And so it's really interesting. I think agency is a big theme here. It's a big theme for conversations. It's like it is the pillar of misinformation is providing agency, even though it's a false sense of agency. And it's how I think we have to build our communication, which is why for public health discourse too, I think we all agree, Liz, that we have to switch from the what to the why. We're living in an information, the era of information. So you can no longer tell people what to do. Why? Right? Because right now that's framed under obedience and compliance. So you want to tell people why, why. And why is that important? You're making them now feel participants in their process. That's what misinformation does so well. Like, they make them feel like they're actively participating. So when medicine says, hey, look, we have nothing for your symptoms because we don't have all the answers, these folks are stepping in and filling a gap and saying, well, wait, I've got something you could do, even though we know it won't work, even though it may cause more harm, even though it may delay treatment. But that's why it's working, because it's giving people a sense of agency. And that's, again, the takeaway. If you have a takeaway today, is like what Liz brought up, agency, I think, is how we need to revamp communication between physicians and patients.
I would echo something that Liz and Nini both said, which is the devaluation of expertise. I mean, that's not only a messaging thing, it's a literal disenfranchisement when you look at the mass firings and resignations that have occurred at the CDC and the NIH, the defunding of research. Ideally, we want medicine and science to be non-ideological. They should exist on their own merits. And as physicians, that's important, for us interacting with patients from all backgrounds and all ideologies. And to echo what Liz said, saying I don't know is something that you guys already know to say, right? You already know it's better to tell somebody, I don't know the answer for sure. Here are my best guesses and this is why, or this is what I propose to do to evaluate next. Those are not the messages, like Nini just said, that people are getting from social media, but it's more nuanced and it's harder and it's more time consuming, but it's the right thing.
Yeah.
I have a question. Nini, you brought up approaching those people who have different viewpoints and spending time with them and talking to them. How do you think that might change, with what's been happening recently, where, it's no longer like about feelings or opinions, but you see something objective, like a video of something horrible happening, but then the government is saying, like, actually, this is what you're seeing. Like, how do you navigate, like, talking to people who see it as like who believe things blindly and refuse to think critically in a situation like this?
That's an excellent question. I actually just wrote about this. And I could send over some slides too, Kim, if you want, on like, risk communication and how, like we're pretty much people are absorbing, we're into different like media ecosystems, perhaps even more than that. But let's just say for now, some people are like we're looking at the same information and people are just walking away with different takes, right? And so much of this is like, built around identity. And I actually did just talk about how do we approach those conversations, right? These are really hard conversations. A lot of the work that I do on social media moved to that trusted messenger model where I give you tips to have those conversations. Because realistically, the odds of me changing someone's mind online, it's much slimmer than somebody who is having like more, intimate interactions with those individuals, right? And again, to kind of reemphasize what Liz said, you can't, obviously, when you're having like these trusted conversations, you can't come in, with like, oh, well, you're that. No, like that's never going to work, right? Because people are more likely to listen to you and to be receptive to what you have to say when like they trust you, right? This is the whole trusted messenger model of communication. When they trust you and they see you as somebody who is trying to like, understand them, not criticize them, right? And so I think one thing that, I think it's really important is to first try to understand why individuals believe what they do, right? And, and there are many different reasons. It could be, ideological. It could be that they don't understand the data. Like I've been in situations where somebody is saying something and it turns out that they misinterpreted a study, right? So the reasons are various. But what I always like to, do is kind of push them a little bit and say, try to like, because a lot of people are just repeating, right? They're repeating what they heard or what they thought they saw or what they like, or what a friend told them, right? And I say like make them defend that. Ask them, why is this justified? Or why do you think that this is effective? There are many different ways that you could question someone without being like confrontational or making them get defensive. Like one thing that one question that I asked recently, I was at a dinner and we were talking about immigration. And I point blank asked, okay, so do you think that X and Y and Z problems would go away? Like if we let's get rid of that one thing that you think is causing all this dismay, right? And that's applicable to many things, right? So when people want to demonize like something like seed oils, right? And you ask them, okay, so if remove seed oils, given all of these other things that, right, dictate our health and well-being, is the problem going to go away? Like, what is the impact of this in the bigger scheme? So there is a guide of questions to really try to get somebody to rationalize through their thought process, because you don't want to give them the answer. You want them to arrive to that conclusion, and you want to guide them through that process by asking them questions. And it's not going to happen right away. It's not something that you're going to go there and you're going to have a conversation and a person is going to walk away and be like, oh, you changed my mind. No, like this is something that takes iterative discussion and conversation. I would say that even in my experience, it's like, sometimes like 10, 15 different encounters where you're having like these conversations. Sometimes it's pretty effective. Sometimes you could just point to something and somebody is like, you know what, I hadn't really thought about that, but really trying to guide them through that process. Like as I did with my friend, and I said, hey, well, you're drinking a glass of wine, so explain to me, why do you think this specific ingredient, right? Because she was like really honing in on like, I don't know if it was disodium phosphate or something. We make a joke about it now, but back then she was like, I don't want foods with these ingredients. And I asked her, well, can you explain to me why this specific ingredient? And then she sent me a whole bunch of like literature. But of course, you can imagine the literature is stuff that's like done on rodents, stuff that, it's been taken out of context. And I'm explaining to her, well, what do you think would happen if we gave, a rodent this much water, right? Water is something that's completely benign, right? And we all know that if you drink sufficient water in a short amount of time, you could get hyponatremia. And so it's really trying to help them rationalize. And yeah, it's not easy, but that's why I think it's like pick a few individuals and that you care about and have those conversations, because you can't change everybody's mind. Like, I don't try to change people's mind online. I give people tools to do that.
Yeah, I would echo that. Is like I have had a lot of conversations with people and I have helped change a lot of people's minds. But oftentimes it's because I've built a relationship with them over time, which is one of the things that's hard to do in social media. So I view my role in social media as more as equipping trusted messengers, because we all are trusted by somebody, whether you're a friend or a partner or a doctor or a nurse or a teacher or a clergy member. You have people in your life who trust your opinion and who value your insights. And I think of the work that I do as really enabling those trusted messengers to have the language and the reasons and all of the explanations that they can then take into their communities. Because what ultimately will help change minds is having like consistent relationship building. And I think one thing I run into a lot is when I'm talking to people about this work, I often will get people in my comment section saying, well, I tried it one time and it didn't work. And I'm like, well, it's never going to take one time. So I told you I was raised anti-vaccine. I wasn't vaccinated until I was 23 and about to go to graduate school, where I knew that I was going to probably study the immune system. So it took me like 4 years to really like change my mind about the things that I had been raised in for decades. Well, by that point, yeah, about 2 decades by that point. So it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience. It was relationships and stories and information combined that helped me change my mind. It wasn't just facts. So I think that's the hardest part in all of this, is that it does take a lot of time. So I like to think about it as planting seeds, and maybe me or somebody else will go back in the future to water them, and maybe it will actually make a difference. And I've had people come back to me years later being like, hey, I thought about what you told me. I went and talked to some other people, and now I went and got my kid vaccinated, or whatever it is we were talking about. But it took a long time. It wasn't just one interaction.
I have a follow-up question to this conversation. So, some of us are going into emergency medicine, and a lot of times our interactions with our patients are like we don't have that longitudinal care where they will come back for clinic visits and we can keep having that conversation with them. And so, something that like I feel like I've already run into in medical school is like at least in like the pediatric emergency department is parents saying like I'm not vaccinating my child, and me like not knowing like what the best thing I can say in that brief period of time is. Because I think obviously like I don't want to already shatter like trust that's hard to build in like this acute setting, but also I don't want to become complacent to the point where every time a family comes in and they're anti-vax, I just am like, oh, I don't have time to deal with this right now. Um, so I was just wondering if you guys had any like advice or recommendations for like things that would be important to bring up when you can't really establish like a long-term relationship with people.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that, because those are much harder conversations. And even in like a non-emergency setting, like my own pediatrician has brought up how, and I think there was a great piece in Stat News, right, where the conversation has really changed to having legitimate questions about vaccines to like just wanting to neglect that care altogether. And so, I think going back to like that trust, right? You're building trust even in an emergency care setting. And so like really, uh, kind of like spotlighting that, right? And saying, you know what? Uh, and this is an argument that I use as like I say, if you trust your doctor enough to treat you, right? Remind them, right? If you trust me to treat you, right? You know, I'm here to tell you what we could do to prevent me from having to treat you in the first place for these things, right? And really, at that point, what you're doing right there is, again, you're pointing to a bit of that logical inconsistency, right? Because at the end of the day, it is a selective rejection of science when it comes to rejecting vaccines. The same parents who reject vaccines won't bat an eye when their kids need to be hospitalized, right? Like they're going to show up to the ER. So really pointing out that they're already there. So if they're there, it's because somehow they are trusting something about like the scientific process, something about modern medicine, right? And so, I think bringing attention to that in that short, span of time, it's not easy, right? It may not always be effective. Another thing that you can do is so many of us have resources because we've done this for so long, or physicians. So like almost any question that somebody has about like vaccines, I think we've covered from many different angles. So also like, building a repertoire of resources for specific questions where you can say, hey, what are your specific concerns, right? So for instance, one of the perfect example is people have framed vaccines as like, we're getting too many, right? Like, oh, we're getting too many vaccines today. And one thing that I always we all point out to, is how despite the fact that we're getting twice as many vaccines as we used to get in the 1980s, the total number of antigens that were exposed through vaccination is about 75,000 times lower, right? So we've gone from about 15,000 antigens, primarily driven by the pertussis, like the Elisabeth pertussis vaccine, the whole cell pertussis vaccine, that had about 3,000 and something antigens and there were 5 doses, right? So we've gone from that to that. And that is progress, right? Because one thing that happens, especially in these settings, right? You think about it, it's really fascinating. So when people are, it's a risk perception thing. So when people are healthy, right, they fear vaccination because they have more to lose if something goes wrong, right? If you think about it, it's like, oh, well, if I and people tend to over amplify risks. I used to work in aviation and I've never seen, people are always so scared of like, the turbulence and airplanes, and I'm like, you would have to fly for like 300,000 years for something to happen, like statistically, but it's still like an irrational fear, right? So people are really over amplifying the risks of vaccines. And the reason that they're doing that is because if you think about it, the risk of disease is kind of absent from their mind. Now, switch that. When they are now sick, right, all of a sudden they're willing to now take on treatments that carry more risk, right? Because now their whole perception has shifted. So now, like if they don't take treatment, they have more to lose. So it's really fascinating to see how people perceive risk. And this is something that I talk about a lot. Safety and risk are not the same. Safety is how you feel about risk. Risk we can quantify. Like I can tell you, like, what are the odds of a commercial aircraft accident in the US is 1 out of 150 million, right? Very, very rare. But that doesn't mean people don't feel safe, right? People just, I don't feel safe because so it's very, very different. And so I think really bringing attention to like that trusted relationship so that they realize that they are already trusting you, because they're there, right? So they are already trusting you, and that may not work the first time, but it'll get them thinking about like that inconsistency. Oh, I am deciding to trust modern medicine in these circumstances, but somehow I'm rejecting it here. So it's just something to think about.
Thank you.
Izzy, I love that question as an ER doctor. Who you and is it Irene are thinking of emergency medicine? Is that right?
Phoebe.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. If I can give you one piece of advice, like everything in the ER happens at speeded up scale and abbreviated scale, right? You have one chance to establish rapport with somebody in basically the first few seconds that you're talking with them. So one thing I found helpful in emergency medicine is going into a room and right off the bat saying, what is the thing you need the most from me today? It cuts out a lot of, it helps you too, because it cuts out some time. You get more to the heart of the matter quickly, but you also see what they really want. And I also like to say, I do not want to do anything to hurt you, and I want to help you. I want you to feel better, to, not suffer, to all the things that they're there for, right? So have some kind of question, some kind of stock question to establish rapport with your patients quickly, so that they will, in this very limited fashion, trust you as much as they can. And then what Nini said was so great about having resources. You got to find your resources and have them. There's some kind of, let's see, do you guys follow Unbiased Science? Liz Steyer. So they came out today with a paper about whether or not pediatricians make a lot of money off vaccines. So you can look at these sources and refer your patients to them, maybe even make a handout, that you keep on you, or a QR code that they can scan or something to give them some resources to find answers.
Kind of going along with that, I feel like in med school, we don't really get taught on how to kind of communicate, like from a public health perspective. But I guess, like, would you say there's like certain skills you feel like the med school curriculum would benefit from when it comes to like teaching public health and speaking to a wider audience?
In general, we don't train anyone how to do this. We don't train scientists how to do this. We don't train public health professionals how to do this. We don't train medical doctors how to do this. I recently was at a conference. I was at the American Public Health Association conference in a panel session with like the deans of public health schools across the US, including a former surgeon general. And all of them were like, we don't know how to teach our students how to do this. And I looked at my friend who was in the room with me, and we just were like, what in the world? So they don't know how to do this either. But I will say that, yes, I think that it needs to be embedded in our curriculum, because it's not actually that hard to do. I've taught at multiple instruction levels, and I embedded science communication into the material that I did. So usually the hard part, right, is like everyone's like, well, we have content we have to cover, and we have to assess whether or not you're actually learning that content. That tends to be like the way people wrestle with this. The reality, though, is we can change the way that we're assessing whether or not people are actually learning the content. And I did that by actually making them produce materials for public consumption. So op-eds, social media posts, blog posts, infographics, information sheets, whatever you could sky's the limit in the kinds of assignments you can do. And it still allowed me to assess outcomes for the students that I was working with, but it also then helped them learn the ways in which they could then communicate this material to a general audience. So I think it does need to start to be a structural change happening, starting from bachelor, when people are in pre-med and in science majors and in public health majors, because it really is not that hard to do. The problem is traditionally we don't incentivize this kind of work, which is back to what Nini and I were saying earlier, is that we do all of our social media work on the side for free, in addition to whatever it is that's actually paying our bills. And that is because historically tenure systems and other means of promotion and tenure don't actually traditionally value public communication. And this is why I left my faculty position, because I was told by the dean that I was spending too much time talking to the public when I should have been actually doing service for the university, which meant sitting on committees where they didn't want to actually hear what I was doing anyway. So I think we have to really change the system. What does give me hope, though, is I am seeing more and more people who are wanting to do that. I'm seeing more, like I'm going and giving a whole workshop to leaders of public health schools in March, because they're like, well, what do we do? How do we tell better stories? How do we actually do this communication work? I wish they had done this like 20 years ago. But I do think we're getting there. But it does need to be part of our training.
Yeah, I'm laughing at this a little bit because, we're trying to do some of this in this course. It's one of our major, Sapna, my partner who's not here on the call, but this was one of our reasons for starting to teach this course. We're not getting paid to teach this course. We're doing it for free. Because again, I think there's not a huge value attached to that.
Well, you may not think. Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story. One of my close friends completed a PhD in chemistry, started a very successful company, which you may have heard of, Appeal. Appeal Sciences does a coating for like avocados and like strawberries. It's an organic coating to help prolong the shelf life, right? And this happened while I was pregnant with my daughter, so I wasn't really tapped in. And then after I gave birth, she and I like hung out, and I learned more about what had happened at Appeal because I saw the rise of that company. She's a close friend, so I'm seeing her like, oh my God, they're doing great. They're getting all this funding. They're growing like hundreds of jobs like in the area. It turns out that they were targets of a misinformation campaign. Huge, huge misinformation campaign. And by the way, their customers are not us. It's not people who go to the supermarket to apply the product to the produce. The market are, you know, huge companies. So when they lose a contract, they're losing a $10 to $20 million contract. You know, they're not losing. You know, one customer to them is a lot of revenue. And so now we are actually focusing on trying to get a documentary because I think that when companies start seeing how they can be susceptible, you know, and we've seen this. We know that Revlon hired misinformation researchers too to combat the whole narrative around like, you know, silicones, right? It's everywhere, right? Like, oh, silicones are just bad for your hair and all this misinformation around silicones. So it affected their bottom line too. And so I think that, you know, one way of presenting this, because when I spoke to her, I was like, we have to make a documentary. Like, let's get a filmmaker. When companies, because it could be anywhere, it could be anything. It's like we're seeing it more in medicine, but in reality, any company could be a target of a misinformation campaign as they were. That's like millions of dollars in revenue for a company. Those are jobs. Like they had to like, you know, they laid off like a sizable part of their like workforce because of that. Right. And so I think a lot of, sadly, in our environment where we're not, you know, we should obviously be putting people's health and there should be funding for this. But I think an avenue for it is to make it present for other people too that are outside of the health space. Is like, look, this could be everything that you worked for your whole life. Like you could be subjected to like a misinformation campaign. Anyone could, and then just lose your whole revenue. But it's interesting, yeah. Like a lot of these smaller companies do suffer from some so small and big, and so there is some funding. It's really limited. I do think that creating more awareness around this, which is why I told her, because then she had a baby, and we're like, okay, we'll wait until you're out of the you know, the early newborn toddler years to do this. I think creating awareness about and humanizing the people that are target of it. Because one thing that's happening right now that, you know, sadly RFK is doing, he's dehumanizing doctors. That's how this works. In order for you to create a villain, you have to dehumanize people. I mean, that's like the whole narrative around like immigrants too, right? You have to dehumanize them because that's how you can get other people to like, you know, believe you, like thinking that someone or some entity is inherently evil, right? And I think trying to humanize, which is why I really like your answer, Kim, about, you know, having that first encounter as a physician and pretty much saying, hey, you know, what can I do to help you? Because what that's doing is you're humanizing yourself in front of that patient. Like, I'm a person too. I am here to care for you, right? Like there's no ill intent here. So much of the rhetoric revolves around trying to not only just discredit, you know, the expertise, but also the intent of physicians, right? Like there's ill intent. Oh, they're trying to keep us sick. When I don't think anything could be further from the truth. Like physicians go into this to help people. It's not an easy job. I know I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't become a doctor. It's like you're at, you know, you're at the front lines of, you know, uncertainty and having to deal that with compassion while managing complex medical situations, right? That is not easy. But I think trying to humanize the medical professionals again, I think would be huge in what's happening right now. Because so much of it is about like, it just depends on dehumanizing you guys.
I guess I have one final question. Sort of goes in that same vein that you were talking about with the dehumanization. A lot also in the article it mentions about trying to make sure we're communicating, excuse me, like not from a place of shaming the others or putting ourselves as a condescending third party and being a trusted messenger. So how do you think physicians can balance, especially physicians with large social media presences, how can they balance being a trusted messenger without coming across as shaming other people, shaming individuals? How do you try to combat misinformation with a strong tone, but making sure that you're still being well received by the public?
Yeah, I think that in general, there's like a very clear line between addressing misinformation and then what I call tribalism, which is like trying to shame a person. They're very clear, like what we call, and I even don't like this term a lot, but there's very clear, like, bad actors, people that are doing it because they're monetizing misinformation, right? Like, clearly, most people have like genuine questions. Personally, I try to just address like the question, right? Like, oh, this question showed up without having to show the person who asked it or anything like that. I think that's one way of moving away. That way you're just addressing the question, right? Don't make it about, one of the bigger logical fallacies is, a character attack. Even if someone is, they're with ill intent, right? You're not really going to win the argument by calling that out, right? So you still focus on the argument. This is why, like this argument, is bad. I honestly, I never talk about like my own set of expertise. I never bring up like, I think maybe like once or twice I brought up that I have a PhD when I have like a about me post. I never bring it up. I don't say, oh, like when I do videos, I'm not like, oh, I'm Nini and I have a PhD, and I don't do that. I personally don't like it. I'm the type of person that believe in people being capable with enough training, even without, some fields definitely you need to go to school, but there's a lot of people that I know that, did a lot of training and they got really smart. And so I don't like to discredit people for the number of degrees attained. So I also don't bring that to my brand. I never lead with I'm a PhD or I do this. I just strictly stick to the argument because that way I'm not trying to leverage my credentials, as a means to correct, because that comes off as really condescending. So really getting away from you and moving to the argument directly. That's my recommendation, right? Even though you know that you know more, you know that you have more expertise, you know that you have more training, but that's a turnoff. Right now, for many individuals, like there is, sadly, there is like this sense of like that you're an elitist if you have training, which is really silly. Because we don't say that about pilots. It's like, oh, you're such an elitist, like, right? It's something very, very niche to like, scientists and medical professionals. But, sadly, that's the media ecosystem that we're in. So just lead into the argument directly.
The only thing I want to add to that, though, is I think there's an important distinction between what the person's intention is. So I will say those who rage bait and shame on social media have very big followings.
Yeah.
And they do that because they build a coalition of followers who agree with them. So they're going to those pages and they're being like, yes, like I agree these people are dumb, or I'm mad about this too.
Yeah.
And that is ultimately not the take that I do in my communication. So I'm my content is inherently not as engaging because I'm focused on bridge building, which means I am leading with empathy and I am trying to be compassionate in my response to people. I'm not calling them out by name like Nini mentioned, but I might be like, yeah, I understand why as a mom you want to make the best decision for your kid. And then like, right, but that isn't necessarily as catchy. But that is the cost that I've done because I'm more focused on trying to bridge build to reach the people who actually don't already agree with me. So I think it really just depends on what the intention is of the person running the account, because anger and shaming does grow big followings really fast.
Yeah, it will. Yeah. So we got a question. Instead of creating infographics pamphlets from scratch, short form, I think CHOP has a lot of good resources, especially about vaccines. Short form resources to disseminate. Is this specific to vaccines or just in general?
I was just like asking in general, but like because
Okay.
vaccines are such a hot topic, like I was wondering if there's like,
Yeah, so CHOP
stuff that
has a
you
lot of
use.
good resources. And then one account that is David Gorski, he's like, he writes a blog called Science-Based Medicine. He's amazing. Like, he's an OG. I think he started doing this way before any one of us did. And he does pretty comprehensive analyses of many different topics. We do through our Substacks as well. I haven't done long form content in a few months. So I had started a new job. I'm going to get back into it and more like statistical literacy. But for instance, I talk about radiation and I looked at 100 studies. Like, what does this say? Why is like why are you okay, right? Like with your Wi-Fi and your 5G, or um, uh, or even like fluoride. I think something that we're seeing a lot is that when people see conflicting studies, right? So they don't know how to interpret that. I don't expect people without a background in science to be able to interpret, complex scientific findings, especially when they are already not trusting institutions, right? So here comes a study and says, well, we found out that fluoride, blah, 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 right? It's like the next boogeyman. And then, of course, you read through the study and you find all these flaws. And then on top of that, you find that the fluoride consumptions in the study were much higher than, right, what, we regularly consume. So I think so much of it is spending some time in your already busy schedule getting familiarized with the literature, because they end up being the same arguments. So one thing is that where I am right now, like I didn't start out being able to like interpret a study like in 1, 2, 3 minutes. It took me a while to get very, very familiar with like what are the statistical pitfalls. Like I could take a look at two populations right now and just be like, oop, those are two identical. There are two identical. That's a fabricated data point right there. And so a lot of practice, because it's the same techniques. It's different flavor, right? They're different flavors of the same thing, right? Small samples, people doing things like p-hacking, and that's really where a lot of this is coming from. Is and I had this, in one of my slides, it's like publication bias. So usually you see studies where they find an effect are the ones that are more likely to be published than the studies where they don't find an effect. So it skews the literature, right? To some extent, right? And so like we see this, and we see this with fluoride, right? And for many different other things. So you get a skew of the literature, and then when you dig through it, they're really poorly conducted studies, not very replicable, and the effect size, like how strong of an effect something had, is pretty small. And so getting acquainted with, in my opinion, getting acquainted with some of those statistical literacy tools has been key. Like for me, it's just like now it's like I could do it like on my lunch break. People send me a study and I'm like, oh, this, like right away. And that just came through practice.
I think we're out of time, right? I don't want it to keep students longer.
Go ahead if you have
Thank me
something
too.
to add. I would love to hear
No,
it.
I don't have. I just was saying in the chat, I did drop a couple links. The Evidence Collective, we have a recommendations page, and we also have briefs that we make. The briefs are geared towards like trusted messengers, so public health officials, medical providers. But now that we have some funding, we are hoping to actually start translating those for patient-facing content as well. So you can kind of bookmark those two websites.
And definitely follow Nini and Liz, because I learned stuff about medicine from you guys. I like the way your information is so concise and easy to understand, and I've shared it with a lot of people. So a lot of accounts like that that you can probably find once you start following a few of them. Well, guys, thank you so much. Like, this was wonderful. I am deeply grateful for your time, especially when I know how little of it you have. I think the students join me in saying we really appreciate this time you spent with us. Thank you.
Thanks for
We're
having
happy to
us.
be here. Yeah, thanks for having us.
And you feel free to share my email with